Moments ago, at a grand state dinner hosted by the French president, a single question shattered royal protocol: where is Queen Catherine? Eyewitnesses claim President Macron publicly overlooked Queen Camilla and instead asked for the Princess of Wales by name. What began as a ceremonial gathering has now erupted into an international royal scandal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The opulence of the Lies Palace had barely settled into its rhythm when the atmosphere shifted. According to reports surfacing within minutes of the event, French President Emmanuel Macron, during a customary exchange of pleasantries with the royal delegation, skipped the expected greeting for Queen Camilla. Instead, in front of dignitaries, press, and foreign guests, he leaned slightly and asked with deliberate clarity, "Where is Queen Catherine?" Those 5 words froze the room. Camilla, seated several chairs away from Macron, not beside him, as protocol might suggest, was said to have stiffened. The French president continued his toast without any direct acknowledgement of her, offering a subtle smile that many are now calling strategic. French political commentators didn't wait long. Within the hour, headlines erupted across major outlets. Catherine named, Camilla omitted. Macron's royal preference? Some claimed it was a calculated move, a diplomatic signal that France recognizes a different kind of future for Britain's monarchy, one that doesn't revolve around Camilla. Catherine's absence was explained by the palace as a precaution due to ongoing recovery and rest, but insiders suggest the timing was far from coincidental. Rumors swirled days before that tensions between the royal households and foreign embassies had reached an icy impasse, with senior aides reportedly unsure how to position Camilla on the global stage without drawing criticism. While officials insist Macron's words were merely informal curiosity, others argue this wasn't an accidental omission, it was an intentional spotlight. And if that's true, the implications are staggering. In diplomatic circles, symbolic gestures often speak louder than official communiques. Macron's question could easily be read as a subtle but powerful nod toward a monarchy led by William and Catherine, rather than Charles and Camilla. This wasn't just about names, it was about legacy, perception, and power. Sources close to the Lies suggest the question came after private concerns were raised about Camilla's increasing influence, not just within the firm, but in the public-facing aspects of monarchy abroad. One diplomat allegedly warned that Camilla's presence risked complicating protocol. If true, this would mark one of the most visible examples of international pushback against her role. But this stunning moment didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the climax of weeks of mounting tension behind palace doors and across diplomatic channels. Before the cameras captured the glamour of the state dinner, something was already broken. A silent rift had been growing between Buckingham Palace and the Lies, one that may have influenced who sat at the royal table and who didn't. What the public saw was the curated version of diplomacy: polished silver, carefully scripted smiles, and perfectly arranged photo opportunities. But beneath that glossy surface, the lead-up to the event had been marred by a brewing disagreement between British royal aides and French protocol officers. At the heart of it all was one central, unspoken tension: who would be the royal face of Britain at one of the most symbolic European state dinners in years. Originally, sources confirm Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been the palace's choice. Early briefings reportedly listed her name as a key attendee. And with her growing reputation as the true future queen in the eyes of many both at home and abroad, her presence would have sent a powerful message. But then, without explanation, her name vanished from the official guest list. Insiders say it wasn't illness or recovery that pulled her out. It was pressure. Diplomats from the French side were allegedly more eager to host Catherine than Camilla. One aide disclosed, under condition of anonymity, that French officials strongly hinted that Catherine's presence would be viewed as a unifying modern gesture. But for some inside the palace, that suggestion cut too close to a dangerous line. If the future was being prematurely embraced by foreign powers, where did that leave the present monarchy? Where did that leave Camilla? In the days leading up to the event, frantic coordination unfolded behind closed doors. Notes were exchanged, calls placed in hushed tones. A quiet power struggle emerged, pitting tradition against optics. Those loyal to Camilla reportedly demanded her inclusion regardless of preference, citing rank and respect. But others closer to William and Catherine saw an opportunity to strengthen the monarchy's image on the global stage. The battle wasn't just about dinner seating. It was about legacy. And that battle, it seemed, was lost before it even began. A particularly damning quote emerged from a senior palace aide who allegedly remarked, "Camilla wasn't their first choice." That one sentence captured the entire dilemma. Camilla represented continuity, but Catherine symbolized something far more potent: hope. International audiences had increasingly embraced her calm poise and genuine warmth, often comparing her to Queen Elizabeth herself. France, it appeared, was no exception. While the final decision kept Camilla in the spotlight, it did little to mend the growing perception that Catherine had been sidelined for reasons that had little to do with health. The real question, the one being whispered across both royal and political circles, was whether Catherine had been deliberately pulled back, or whether someone inside the palace had made sure she never stepped forward in the first place. As whispers grew louder, one question refused to disappear: was Catherine deliberately kept away? Or did someone inside the palace ensure she didn't show? The official line was health concerns, but those close to Catherine suggest something more complex. Her sudden withdrawal from the state dinner wasn't just unexpected, it was orchestrated. But by whom? And why now? Only days before the event, Catherine had reportedly begun preparing for her appearance in Paris. Schedules were aligned, attire confirmed, and diplomatic aides were briefed on her role. There was excitement, quiet and dignified as always, surrounding her participation. After all, this was to be her first major international outing since stepping back into the public eye following a period of recovery. The timing was symbolic, the gesture subtle but potent. Catherine, rising anew, representing not only the future of the monarchy, but a reassuring continuity the world seemed to crave. And then, with a single curt announcement, everything changed. The palace issued a statement citing ongoing medical recovery and the necessity of rest. It was phrased with care, crafted to end questions before they began. But the questions did come, and they didn't stop. Insiders with knowledge of the situation painted a different picture. Catherine, they claimed, was well enough to travel. In fact, just 72 hours before the statement, she had been actively reviewing briefing material on the French delegation. Her schedule, though light, was still quietly in motion. And yet something or someone had intervened. Speculation mounted that the decision came not from Catherine herself, but from higher up, perhaps from within the palace machinery that seeks to preserve appearances. Or worse, perhaps from within the walls of influence where power and envy often wear the same crown. William, sources say, was furious. Not in the explosive theatrical sense, but in the tight, calculated anger of a man who had watched his wife be sidelined. He was reportedly blindsided by the speed and finality of the announcement. No room for debate, no moment for consideration. Just a statement, already polished and ready. And while his frustration simmered behind closed doors, Camilla, according to whispers among senior staff, appeared relieved. The optics would be simpler now. There would be no competing narrative, no juxtaposition of future versus present. She would take the mantle at the dinner, uninterrupted. But that only deepened the suspicion that Catherine's absence had not been accidental. Was this a strategic removal meant to shield her from scrutiny, or silence her growing influence? Or was it a form of exile, dressed in the delicate language of health and healing? The royal family has never needed drama to find itself in the headlines. Often the quietest moves speak the loudest. And this move, this vanishing, has left behind echoes far louder than any public appearance might have. But while Catherine remained in the shadows, Camilla stepped into the spotlight only to face a silence more deafening than applause. For Queen Camilla, this was meant to be a triumph, a moment to cement her place on the world stage. Instead, it became a mirror reflecting the cold reality of her public perception. As the chandeliers glittered above and the polished silver clinked gently in the hands of foreign dignitaries, one thing became uncomfortably clear: Camilla was not the center of this story. All eyes, from political analysts to the French media elite, were searching for someone else. The Queen Consort, seated several paces away from President Macron, appeared composed. But something was off. Her smile was strained, her nods polite but hollow. Because even in the grandeur of the Lies Palace, the absence of one woman was louder than Camilla's presence could ever be. And behind closed doors, that truth was finally spoken aloud. Macron's offhand toast, intended only for a small group, has now become royal folklore. According to multiple sources within the French delegation, the president turned mid-sentence, glanced at the British table, and casually inquired, "Where is Queen Catherine?" There was no correction, no chuckle, no acknowledgement of the gaffe. Just silence. A silence that said far more than any diplomatic phrasing ever could. In that moment, the image of royalty in the minds of international leaders was no longer attached to titles, but to faces, and Catherine's face had already won that crown. The French press didn't hold back. Publications known for their sharp tongue and unforgiving commentary dissected Camilla's posture, her expressions, and most damning of all, her inability to connect with those in the room. Articles referred to her demeanor as distant, her small talk as rehearsed, and her command of French as hesitant. Every headline cut a little deeper. Even neutral observers began comparing her appearance to what might have been, had Catherine attended. It was not just a political embarrassment, it was a branding failure. Back in London, damage control went into overdrive. Aides tried to steer the narrative toward tradition and honor, emphasizing Camilla's grace and continuity. But it was no use. The footage was out. The photos told their own story. And those paid to analyze the nuance, the body language experts, the diplomatic correspondents, were unanimous. Camilla had been tolerated. Catherine would have been celebrated. Inside the palace, the sting was worse. Camilla's team, according to insiders, was blindsided. They had fought hard for her spotlight moment, only to find it dimmed by an absence no one could ignore. Worse still, that absence had become the story. No matter how much spin was deployed, the question hung in the air like a sword over the monarchy's fragile balance of image and influence. If the Queen Consort could not command presence on a global stage, what did that say about the institution she represented? But the frost in the room was no accident. It was the product of years of quiet diplomacy and public admiration that had crowned Catherine long before any title was given. To France, Catherine is more than a princess, she is a symbol. For over a decade, the French public and press have embraced her elegance, her restraint, and her royal mystique. And this state dinner only revealed how deep that affection runs. Even before she set foot in Paris years ago, Catherine, Princess of Wales, had already captured the French imagination. In a country that reveres grace and poise, her name became synonymous with quiet strength. The fashion houses whispered her name in admiration. Cultural critics compared her timeless presence to icons like Grace Kelly and Queen Letizia. She wasn't just admired, she was adopted. French tabloids rarely indulged in scandal when it came to Catherine. Instead, they praised her diplomacy, her bilingual efforts, her subtle yet undeniable charisma. In a media environment known for its sharp critiques and unflinching satire, Catherine remained untouched. And that wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of deliberate presence, consistent dignity, and a restraint that drew fascination rather than frustration. When French presidential staff previously planned major royal events, one name always surfaced first: Catherine. She wasn't just a representative of the crown, she was the crown's most beloved export. Invitations from Li's aides often came with subtle preferences, unspoken yet clear. Her attendance brought prestige. Her absence left a void. So when word broke that she would not attend the state dinner, it wasn't only royal watchers who noticed. It was the French public, and the disappointment echoed through editorial pages, television panels, and online forums. Opinion pieces speculated about the real reasons behind her absence, often returning to the same conclusion: this wasn't simply a matter of health. It was politics. Macron's now infamous question, "Where is Queen Catherine?" wasn't merely a diplomatic stumble. It reflected something deeper, something cultural. For the French people, it didn't matter whether Catherine had been crowned or not. In their eyes, she already was royalty in the truest sense. Regal not by proclamation, but by presence. Their loyalty wasn't bound by succession or ceremony. It was emotional, instinctive, and enduring. And while Camilla's presence failed to spark a similar connection, Catherine's absence only reinforced the depth of her influence. Her mystique was never built on noise, but on silence, on restraint, consistency, and an unshakable sense of purpose. In France, that mystique had become affection. And in that affection, an entire narrative had taken root. Catherine wasn't just the future of the monarchy, she was its embodiment. But admiration abroad only magnified the discomfort at home, especially for Charles, who now faced a political balancing act between wife, son, and the crown itself. Back in London, King Charles found himself at the heart of a storm, forced to choose between defending Camilla's place and acknowledging the world's growing allegiance to Catherine. And the pressure was coming from inside the palace. The fallout from Macron's offhand remark had barely begun to settle when Charles was pulled into a quiet but ferocious reckoning. The optics of the French state dinner had done more than bruise egos, they had shaken the very foundation of the monarchy's internal alignment. Aides close to the king described him as stunned and unusually quiet, after receiving a direct briefing on the incident. The phrase Queen Catherine, spoken aloud in a foreign hall of power, echoed louder than any crown Camilla had ever worn. And while Charles had grown accustomed to managing scandals from the outside, this one cut from within. Senior courtiers, once hesitant to disturb royal dynamics, now voiced a growing concern. The monarchy could not afford to look out of step with global sentiment. Anne, steadfast and always loyal to duty, was said to have confronted her brother behind closed doors, warning him that the monarchy was at risk of appearing tone-deaf. William, though more restrained, reportedly echoed the same message, emphasizing the need for future-focused optics, a phrase that left little room for interpretation. In hushed tones, a new reality began to surface. Catherine was not simply next in line, she was already leading in hearts and headlines. Charles, caught in a tightening grip of personal devotion and public expectation, began to withdraw. His love for Camilla had withstood decades of controversy, but now he was faced with a dilemma. No monarch wishes to confront what happens when the world loves someone else more. Sources within Clarence's house spoke of an emotional toll weighing heavily on Camilla. While she put on a brave face, those closest to her described her as shaken and deeply embarrassed. The French visit, which was meant to affirm her legitimacy, had become a quiet humiliation. And still, the palace machine churned on, scrambling to craft statements, reshuffle appearances, and subtly shift focus back to Charles himself. But every adjustment only further highlighted the central void. Catherine's absence now felt orchestrated, not unfortunate. The public wasn't asking why she missed the dinner, they were asking who made sure she wasn't there. And for Charles, time was no longer on his side. The coronation, once imagined as a smooth succession of glory, now demanded a strategic recalibration of roles, visibility, and public loyalty. The monarchy had always survived on precision and perception. But now, both were under siege. And just as the monarchy tried to control the narrative, another headline emerged, this time from within Catherine's circle, and it sent shockwaves across Europe. She didn't need a microphone. In her first appearance following the state dinner, Catherine let the world know exactly where she stood, not with words, but with calculated presence. And it spoke louder than any address. Just 24 hours after the royal no-show that had dominated international headlines, Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepped into a children's hospice on British soil with the calm confidence of someone who knew the world was already watching. She didn't reference Paris. She didn't mention the palace's silence. She didn't need to, because every element of her appearance had already been weaponized into a statement of purpose. The choice of attire, a French designer known for subtle elegance, was no accident. The timing, impeccable. And the tone, pure resolve. While cameras had searched for her in the candlelit halls of Lai's palace, here she was grounded, gracious, and entirely in control of her own spotlight. There were no royal handlers briefing the press, no declarations, no carefully curated sound bites. Yet the headlines practically wrote themselves. The Queen who never needed a crown. Real royalty resurfaces. Social media ignited within hours. Hashtags like #WhereIsCatherine and #RealRoyalty trended across continents, drowning out any remaining coverage of the French visit. Commentators who had once played cautiously around royal favoritism were now openly acknowledging a truth long whispered in private circles. Catherine had become the heart of the monarchy, not through decree, but through sheer force of connection. Her absence in Paris had been noticeable. Her return to duty made it impossible to ignore. The public, both domestic and international, seemed to agree. For them, this wasn't just about who wore what crown or who held which title. It was about authenticity, about consistency, about someone who showed up when it mattered, and let actions do the talking. And in a moment where palace narratives were being rewritten on the fly, Catherine's quiet re-emergence offered something rare: clarity. It wasn't about upstaging Camilla. It was about reclaiming a narrative that had been yanked from her hands. And in doing so, Catherine didn't just walk back into public life, she dominated it. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace refused to comment. No press release. No clarification. The silence, once a tool of control, now felt like submission. Every hour that passed without a statement only deepened the impression that Catherine had not been sidelined but liberated. And for Camilla's team, who had hoped the French visit might finally cement her status as a queen embraced abroad, the timing of Catherine's return was a bitter blow. Because for every smiling photograph and viral tweet, one truth became increasingly unavoidable: the public wasn't waiting for a coronation, they had already chosen their queen. And while Catherine's silence gained momentum, Camilla's camp moved into damage control, but the ground was already slipping beneath them. Inside Clarence House, sources describe a furious queen consort, angry, betrayed, and convinced she's being replaced. For Camilla, the question was no longer about respect, it was about survival. The atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating. Behind closed doors, Camilla was no longer the composed public figure smiling for cameras. She was livid. Those close to her say she demanded an emergency meeting with King Charles and top senior advisors, her voice sharp with rage, her tone unrelenting. She wasn't asking questions, she was delivering accusations. Camilla firmly believed she was being systematically sidelined, not just by fate or the media, but by members of the royal institution itself. And at the heart of it, she saw one name rising above her: Catherine. The timing of Catherine's public re-emergence, the public's outpouring of support, and Macron's now infamous comment all combined into a storm Camilla could no longer ignore. She believed the palace was preparing to shift its center of gravity from her reign to Catherine's reign to be. Within hours of that private eruption, word began to leak. A confidential memo meant only for internal eyes made its way into the hands of journalists. It suggested Camilla had formally requested a separate media strategy, one that distanced her from joint appearances and press narratives involving Catherine. The royal communications team, already under intense pressure, scrambled to respond. But the damage was done. The British press, already sensing the tide turning, began printing headlines they once dared not whisper: Queen in crisis, a house divided, Camilla's final stand. And while some loyalists within the firm urged patience and unity, others, especially within Prince William's circle, quietly fueled the shift, arguing that Catherine was the future, and Camilla had simply failed to capture the public's heart. For Charles, the conflict struck at a deeply personal level. This wasn't just politics. This was his marriage. Camilla's humiliation abroad, her fury behind palace gates, and the growing calls for Catherine to take center stage placed him in a no-win situation. Even longtime advisors, once confident in their strategic control over the monarchy's narrative, now feared they were losing grip. Their polling data showed a rapidly widening gap between Camilla's approval and Catherine's. What was once manageable now felt irreversible. Reports suggest Camilla contemplated canceling several upcoming appearances, both out of anger and fear of further embarrassment. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped of the public goodwill she had spent years trying to earn. And more importantly, she feared what no one around her was saying aloud, that she was now more liability than asset. That in the eyes of the world, and perhaps even within the walls of Buckingham Palace, her chapter was closing. But as the monarchy reels from the fallout, a final move is made, one that signals a definitive shift in royal dynamics and global perception. The dinner that was meant to honor tradition instead ignited a turning point. Catherine, long regarded as the future, was now being seen as the present. And the monarchy, knowingly or not, had stepped into its next chapter. What began as a state banquet ended as a royal reckoning. In the days following the diplomatic upheaval, headlines from Paris to New York no longer asked where Catherine was, they asked when she would ascend. Major media outlets didn't mince words. The New York Times dubbed her the de facto queen, while Le Monde praised her as a sovereign in spirit, if not yet in title. What once was whispered among palace staff had now become international consensus. And in this swirl of quiet revolution, the crown, though not physically passed, had shifted in weight. Inside palace walls, the mood turned from tension to realignment. Senior aides began restructuring future engagements. Plans emerged for a global goodwill tour, led not by King Charles or Queen Camilla, but by William and Catherine. Their itinerary, purposefully shaped, reflected an agenda beyond ceremonial duties. It was about connection, vision, and symbolism. And conspicuously, Camilla's name was missing from the draft schedule. The message couldn't be clearer. The monarchy was preparing itself for a softer, subtler succession. Not one announced from a balcony or declared by a trumpet, but shaped in the court of public opinion and sealed in the silence of shifting protocols. Palace insiders privately refer to this transition as the gentle glide. Not a constitutional upheaval, but a redrawing of influence. Catherine, once seen as supportive and secondary, was now viewed as central. Her approval ratings soared, especially among younger demographics who had long felt disconnected from royal affairs. For many, she wasn't just part of the institution, she was the institution they could believe in. Her resilience, her dignity, her silence in the face of provocation had elevated her beyond the confines of protocol. She didn't need to demand power. The public had already handed it to her. In the shadow of all this change, Camilla faded not by exile, but by irrelevance. Her role, while technically intact, had been quietly redefined. The press no longer hung on her appearances. The public no longer looked to her for cues. Even her defenders struggled to justify her place in a narrative now dominated by a woman who wasn't yet queen, but had become something even more powerful, a symbol of continuity, compassion, and quiet strength. The monarchy once again had been reshaped not by decree but by perception. And as the cameras flash and the headlines fade, one truth remains sometimes: the loudest shift in power begins with a whisper heard across the table. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.